I remember standing in my garage on a Saturday morning, staring at the electric meter outside the window while the smell of fresh cut, which still hung in the air from a project I had spent weeks building. The hum of an old power tool was fading. The extension cords were tangled across the floor, and I was looking at another electricity bill sitting on my workbench that somehow felt heavier than the materials I had just carried in. And the frustrating part wasn't the project. It was realizing how much energy it took just to create something simple. Because for millions of homeowners, this has become a familiar feeling. Working harder, spending more, and still feeling like you have less control than you used to. But what if the problem was never how much energy we use? What if the real problem was that we've been taught to think about energy in only one way? Because more than a century ago, one inventor was already exploring ideas that challenged the way people understood electricity. And the question is, what if some of those forgotten principles could help us rethink the way we power our homes today? Most people who look at their rising electricity bills assume the problem is personal. They think, maybe I'm using too much power. Maybe I need better appliances. Maybe there's nothing I can really do except accept higher costs every year. But that assumption is exactly where the frustration begins. Because the issue is much bigger than one person leaving a light on or running a few extra devices. For decades, most homeowners have been placed inside a system where they have very little control over one of their most important monthly expenses. The utility company sets the rates. The infrastructure decides how energy moves. And the average homeowner is left at the end of the chain simply receiving a bill. The problem isn't that people don't care. The problem is what I call the energy information gap. For generations, we've been given very few options beyond buying more efficient appliances or hoping prices don't continue climbing. But outside of the mainstream conversation, engineers, inventors, and independent builders have continued exploring another question. Can everyday people understand energy well enough to create more independence for themselves? That curiosity is what led many researchers and inventors back to principles studied by pioneers like Nikola Tesla in the late 1800s. Not because electricity is magic, not because there is some secret button that eliminates every cost overnight, but because understanding the fundamentals changes how you see the problem. And once you see the problem differently, you start noticing opportunities you never noticed before. Think about the homeowner who opens their mailbox at the beginning of a month. The house is the same. The family habits are the same. The appliances are the same. But somehow, the number printed on that bill keeps moving higher. At first, they make small adjustments. They turn off more lights. They lower the thermostat. They tell their family to be more careful. But after a while, something changes. The frustration isn't about the money alone. It's the feeling that no matter what they do, they are still trapped inside someone else's system. And eventually, they start thinking, maybe there's nothing I can do. What nobody tells you about energy costs is that the emotional weight is often just as powerful as the financial cost. Because it's not just a bill, it's the feeling of losing control. Now imagine another situation. A homeowner decides they want more independence. They research solar panels. They start looking into battery systems. They get excited because finally, there seems to be an alternative. Then reality hits. The installation costs thousands of dollars. The equipment requires planning. The setup feels complicated. And suddenly, the solution that looked simple from a distance feels completely out of reach. The person starts wondering, maybe this is only for people with more money. Maybe I waited too long. Maybe I'm not technical enough to understand any of this. And this is where many people make a mistake that costs them months or even years. They assume the only options are either staying completely dependent on the grid or investing massive amounts of money into expensive systems. But what if there was another approach? A learning-based approach, a hands-on approach, a way to understand principles first, then decide what makes sense for your situation. Now consider the third scenario. Someone who has always been fascinated by how things work. Maybe they spend weekends in their garage. Maybe they repair old equipment. Maybe they enjoy building things instead of buying everything ready-made. They see stories about alternative energy and immediately become curious. But then they hit another wall. The information is scattered. One website says one thing. Another video says something completely different. There are diagrams without explanations, instructions without context, and after spending hours researching, they still don't feel confident enough to start. The internal thought becomes, maybe I'm just not experienced enough. Maybe this is too complicated for someone like me. But here's the part that surprised me the most. All three of these people are dealing with the same hidden problem. The person overwhelmed by electricity bills. The person interested in solar, but discouraged by the cost. The person who wants to build and learn, but doesn't know where to begin. And here's what all three situations have in common. They are not failing because they lack motivation. They are struggling because they lack a clear framework. They have access to information, but they don't have a roadmap. And that difference changes everything. After seeing so many people struggle with the same questions, I started asking a different one. Instead of asking, how can people spend more money to solve their energy problems? I started asking, how can people better understand the technology behind energy itself? That question leads back to a fascinating area of study, the relationship between electricity, magnetism, and energy systems. Nikola Tesla spent years exploring these principles in the late 19th century. His work helped shape the modern electrical world, and many of the concepts he studied continue influencing how engineers think about electricity today. The important lesson is not that one invention from 1894 is going to magically replace every modern energy system. The lesson is that understanding the fundamentals gives people a different perspective, and that is the foundation behind the energy revolution system. Instead of starting with expensive equipment or complicated installations, the approach focuses on helping people understand the concepts, the designs, the components, and the process behind building alternative energy projects. For the homeowner frustrated by rising bills, this creates a new sense of control. For the person who thought solar was financially impossible, it opens a door to learning other approaches. And for the DIY builder, it provides something they were missing all along, a structured path, a collection of plans, diagrams, explanations, and resources designed to remove the confusion. Think about someone like Mark. He was an electrical engineer. He was simply a homeowner who enjoyed building things in his garage. His biggest problem wasn't willingness. It was not knowing where to start. After organizing the information and following a structured process, he finally felt confident enough to experiment, learn, and understand what he was actually building. That shift is often the biggest transformation, not just having a project, but understanding the project. Now, I know what some people are thinking. Sounds interesting, but I'm not an electrician. I don't have a huge workshop. I've been disappointed by energy solutions before. And that's exactly why the approach matters. Because the goal isn't to make everyone an engineer overnight. The goal is to give everyday people a clearer starting point. A retired homeowner doesn't need to become a professional technician to learn new concepts. A weekend DIY enthusiast doesn't need a laboratory to begin understanding energy systems. And someone who has never built anything before doesn't need to feel excluded from learning. I've seen people with limited experience become more confident simply because they finally had information organized in a way they could understand. One homeowner started with basic curiosity and a desire to reduce dependence on rising energy costs. Another started because they wanted a backup mindset for the future and enjoyed learning practical skills. Different reasons. Same discovery. The technology becomes less intimidating when the information becomes clear. And that is why this works. The real advantage is not just the hardware. It's understanding the principles that allow you to make better decisions about energy. Now imagine doing nothing. 6 months from now, the electricity bill arrives again. Maybe it's slightly higher. Maybe prices continue changing. Maybe you are still searching online, watching videos, collecting information, but never feeling confident enough to take the first step. The garage stays the same. The questions stay the same. And the feeling of dependence remains. Not because you didn't care. Not because you weren't capable. Simply because nobody gave you a clear path. But now imagine something different. Imagine having a better understanding of how these systems work. Imagine being able to look at energy differently. Not as something completely controlled by someone else, but as something you can study, understand, and make informed decisions about. That doesn't mean every person will have the exact same results. Every home is different. Every situation is different, but knowledge creates options, and options create confidence. You've already been doing the hard part. You've been searching. You've been questioning. You've been looking for a better way. The missing piece may simply be having the right information organized in the right way. For years, people have blamed themselves for not finding better solutions. But sometimes the problem was never effort. Sometimes the problem was simply not having access to the right roadmap. The first step toward energy independence begins with understanding what is possible. If you want to see the resource I use for exploring these types of builds and concepts, I left a link in the description. And if you found this interesting, make sure to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know what part of energy independence you're most curious about. Because the future of energy doesn't only belong to large companies. It also belongs to people willing to learn.